Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception, and we are here today as when this is being recorded. We are, as my granddaughter reminded me times, this 8 days away from Christmas. I wanted to go and take a look at the very familiar text that is Luke 2 and talk about that. And in doing that, I want to focus on some things that are easy to pass over and miss. I do. Luke 2 has always amazed me, just the profound message that is contained there in such simple language. And the scriptures, through the power of the Holy Spirit, are the ultimate example of that, elevating simple statements to being profound. And another thing the scriptures do that we need to remind ourselves to watch for, the scriptures are, and I'm speaking of them collectively, but we'll just use it here in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2. Luke is the master of understatement. The Holy Spirit is master of understatement. Part of that is because of something that I talk about very frequently. We have a cultural disconnect with this time frame. It's not our world. We didn't live it. We weren't there. And the different things that a statement here, a name there in this text would bring to mind without them having to remind themselves, oh yeah, that's who that guy was. It was just their world. They knew it. It's not our world. We don't know it. We have to work hard to appreciate that setting, that context, those people and their time. And then when we do, we see that there's so much more there than we would have seen without having appreciated that context. But even all of that being said, there are things that are just understated here, and it's profound. It's profound. And we'll talk about I think that the understatement is itself a message. And we'll talk about how. I have talked about Luke 2 before, here popping up underneath me as a thumbnail. I think I did that one last year, Caesar and baby Jesus. And you can go and find that out on YouTube. It's easier to find on BitChute because there are not as many videos. But if you just go to the search bar in BitChute and type that, Caesar and baby Jesus, Luke 2, 1 through 7, it will pull up. But let's read. We're going to read the first 7 verses. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. I spoke just a moment ago about context. Let's go context. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. Who is Caesar Augustus? We hear Caesar. Okay, what was it Bill and Ted said? He's the pizza dude, like Little Caesars. We're not real familiar with this, and maybe some of you out there are more history geeks than others, and you could rattle off and tell me all about Caesar Augustus, but get the picture up here, popping up down below me. And these will just be popping up down below me and not going full screen. There's a software glitch with Logos right now, and you can't click on the image and have it go full screen. So we just have to deal with the smaller image down below me. That's Caesar Augustus, and he's not the pizza dude. This is Caesar Augustus. He was the most powerful man in the world. It can rightly be said that he had more power than did his father, who was his Julius Caesar, had adopted Octavius. That was his name when he became Caesar. It was Caesar. And then Caesar Augustus, the August one, August referring to power and might and prestige and importance and all of that. He was deified. In their world, this guy was God. He was a god, and he was to be worshiped as a god. Now, here's some history, and I'm going into this for a reason, not just to geek out on history. This is some history that you probably are familiar with, even if you're not a big history person. And again, my apologies to all you guys and gals out there who are going, come on, it's Caesar Augustus. Everybody knows who Caesar Augustus is. Caesar Augustus was the one who fought with Mark Antony and Cleopatra when Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the Ides of March, and Brutus, et tu, Brute, Brutus was one of the main ones responsible for that. Julius Caesar's adopted son, Caesar Augustus, vowed to make good on that, to get Brutus and the others, and he did. And with him in that was Mark Antony. But then Mark Antony tried to seize power for himself, and yes, this is a very simplified explanation of that, and ended up aligning himself with the last queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, who history tells us really truly was beautiful. He aligned himself with her, and it was a long, drawn-out battle with all kinds of war, with all kinds of intrigue, but Caesar Augustus won. Interestingly, in that process, someone else whose ugly head is raised here in this narrative is Herod the Great. Herod aligned with guess whom? It wasn't Caesar Augustus. He aligned with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But he was such a political weasel and a smooth talker that he managed to get himself out of that. He went off to Caesar Augustus and managed to sweet talk his way into being okay and keeping rule of Judea. But all of that stuff that I just skimmed over in rapid fashion, all of that information would have been like for people in the United States, me saying, and George W. Bush, I wouldn't have to explain to you who George W. Bush is in contrast to George H.W. Bush. That's just a simple example. Everybody knew this stuff. And the way they looked at Caesar Augustus was, he's not someone to be messed with. He'll cross oceans and wage war and forge political alliances to do you in. You do not cross him. And when he spoke, everyone listened. Now, for those who have heeded my constant pleadings and invitations to go out and spend $3 or $4 on YouTube and watch the Nativity story. There are things that are dramatized in that. Herod wasn't worried in advance about the fulfillment of the prophecy, but it makes for good drama for a movie. Everything else is very accurate in that movie, and that's a minor throwaway point. They have to dramatize things to make it into a movie. But Herod, one thing it portrays very accurately, Herod was scared to death of this guy. He knew he had gotten away with crossing him, and he wouldn't get away with it again. When Caesar Augustus, and listen to the low-key way this is stated, and it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. So we've got, I get the correct map up here this time. No, we want this one. Look below me here. All of this in red was under control of this guy. And I like this statue. This statue was actually found in an excavation of Caesar Augustus' wife's house. It was made after he had died, and we can tell that because he doesn't have shoes on in the statue. But this guy, for all of this part of the world, and remember, if you wanted to get from Rome over to Alexandria, you took a boat, a slow boat, and they went around the coast. They didn't sail out here in the middle of the ocean. It took a long time. This is an inane statement, but important. It was a different world. It took a long time for news just to get places. Controlling this vast of an empire that had a hole in the middle of it because of the Mediterranean, that was the Mediterranean Ocean. It wasn't a help. It was almost a hindrance. That was a vast swath of land to control. Now up here, we've got Germany. And in the movie The Gladiator at the beginning, with that battle scene the movie starts with, that all the guys like, that was up here. But that was 300 years after this. Rome did not yet have control of Britannia. That would come like 100 years after Jesus' birth. But these areas that are in kind of the orangish rather than the red, those were under control of Caesar Augustus. But it was more of, okay, you can rule yourselves, do it exactly the way we say, or we'll kill you and pay us taxes. Notice who else is that way. See down here? Judea. Judea had that status, and because Herod the Great was such a political weasel and conniver, even after he'd crossed Caesar Augustus, he managed to keep it. And I go on about that because it is historically an amazing thing that Herod, first of all, kept his head. He kept his kingdom, but he wasn't going to cross Caesar. Caesar said everyone goes to their own city to be taxed. This is the big point here. Are you ready? With that simple decree, he wrote it down, he stamped it literally with his imprimatur, and everyone started to move. This is something that's very important. I've used this map often, very important in understanding the world at this time. Rome established many things. Rome was far more innovative than most historians give them credit for. But Rome, two big things that everybody thinks of with Rome. One of them I have already alluded to, actually both of them. Number one, Pax Romana, the Pax Romana. Pax is Latin for peace, the peace of Rome. The peace of Rome was enforced at the end of a sword. Cross us and we'll kill you. Cross us and we'll kill you in ways you can't imagine. That's what happens in 70 AD when the temple literally gets leveled and shoved off the Temple Mount. The stones are still there down below the one wall. Cross us and we'll kill you all. Women, children, ducks, chicken, everybody. Don't cross us. That sounds fearful and terrible, and it was, but the world did have peace in all these regions that were always beset with wars between tribal factions and the like, little kingdoms. There was none of that, because if you caused trouble, Rome would squash you. That's one thing. Pax Romana. Number two, their roads. You know, they built roads that are still there. Right behind me going that way, my county has been building a road, redoing a road for a year. They can't get it done. It takes them forever. These guys built roads that are still there. They made them out of what's the equivalent in our minds of cobblestone. They were so well engineered, they're still there. But the Roman road system, and that's what all these tiny little red lines are here, these are the roads that they built. Because if you're going to rule, you need roads. They called it the Via whatever. And I'm actually drawing a blank on any of the Via Appia. That's the Appian Way. That's the road, right? If you're going to rule, you've got to have a road system. Now, all of this stuff, the Pax Romana and the road system also factors into something else very important. This Jesus baby was going to be born, and we actually really will get into that in depth today. But this Jesus baby was going to be born. He was going to grow up and have a bunch of disciples, and then he was going to send 12 of them all over the place. And they used these roads. How do you think Paul got places? How do you think Peter and John and all the rest of them got places? And how was it you could go from over here to up here to then over here and not have any trouble. You didn't even need a passport. It was all Rome. The state name, the what had been country names, as we would think of them, just became provinces. And you could go anywhere and everywhere. And that is why this verse is so important. But when the fullness of the time had come, this Galatians 4:4, but when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. It's all about our redemption. But the fullness of the time, all of this was under the control of Rome. And yeah, Rome's a bad guy. Speaking of personified, it's pictured as a beast in multiple ways, especially in the book of Revelation. It was horrible and it was awful. God used it for his purposes. He caused Rome to be raised up the way it was, because he was going to use it to spread his gospel everywhere. And he was going to use the roads of Rome. And one thing I didn't talk about, it had been that all of this part of the world had been conquered by someone else, one guy, Alexander the Great. And his great legacy that we'll talk about here is Hellenization. He made everybody learn Greek. Another thing the Romans were really good at, if it works, don't fix it. Don't change it. They didn't come in and tell everybody they had to learn Latin, which is a good thing, because compared to Greek, Latin's just, it sounds awful. It's a great language, very effective. It communicates things very, very clearly and concisely. But I would much rather have to read the Bible in Greek than Latin. Greek is beautiful, and well, I'm sorry, offend any Latin fans out there. Latin is not. Managed to turn into really beautiful languages like Italian and Spanish and the other Romance languages, but the core of Latin is not pretty to listen to. So all of this was in place so that, first point, Caesar could say, go. He could point his tyrannical little finger and say, all of you go back to your hometowns to be registered. Why? Because if you're a tyrant and a megalomaniac, you want to know how much control you have. How many people are under my thumb? Remember when David did that? Remember how that played out? God wasn't happy with it. Caesar wanted to know how many people he controlled. He also wanted to know, and it served practical purposes for the sake of governance. How many people are here? How many people are there? How do I need to align all the people under me to govern, rule, and control? But also tax. How much money can I get from them? Figure this much per person. That's how much I want, and then a little more. But this guy spoke, and the whole world moved. And the picture we need to see here is one of contrast. This guy, everyone, I could flip back to one of the maps, everyone knew who he was. Everyone, little kids, knew who he was in that far-flung empire. But someone was going to be born that no one knew who he was. No one knew who his parents were. He was a nobody. He was a nobody. So Joseph, this nobody guy, heads on his way from Nazareth to Bethlehem. So here's a map for that. Got a bigger map for that. Here's Nazareth way up here. And let's get our bearings here, okay? Sea of Galilee up here. Jerusalem down here. Jesus was back and forth throughout all of his ministry, back and forth here, but he had to go with his betrothed wife, Mary, on a donkey, more than likely, because a pregnant woman, there's no way she could walk this far, all the way down here. And down here's the scale. That is 10 miles. Take a look and make sure. Oh, it still says 10 miles. And you look at that and you say, okay, it's 100 miles as the crow flies. They weren't taking crow. They had to take the roads that everybody took and the pathways. It was more than that. But this was also rough country that Mary had to travel through all the way down here to Bethlehem. Imagine doing that, being 8 months pregnant. Kind of hard to imagine. Any women out there who were 8 months pregnant, just imagine hopping on a donkey and riding 100 miles over rough terrain. For my family, think of it's not as rough, but the mountains in Peru. Any of you have been places like that, rough roads, mountainous territory. That's what they were going through. So they went to Bethlehem with Mary, his betrothed wife. Betrothed meaning our term is engagement, but it's not the same. But it was still betrothed because he had not yet known her, because it was the Holy Spirit who had caused her to have this child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. Now, do you see the understatement here? They made this huge, long journey. I went on about it for a minute or two. What does Luke say about it? Nothing. Do you think it was really hard? Yeah. Do you think it was especially hard on Mary? Yeah. Do you think it was exceedingly inconvenient? Yeah. Luke just tells us it happens. And this is just one instance where in the scriptures we see this. There isn't a bunch of editorializing. There isn't a bunch of whining. There isn't a bunch of, framing it so you understand how hard this was for him, because that's not the point. That's not the point. And the Lord was going to give them the strength to deal with it. But there's another thing that's here that I should draw attention to. Life was just harder then. Physically, it was a lot harder. It was a lot harder, and everybody knew it. So if Luke had said a bunch of stuff about how difficult and arduous this journey was and what an inconvenience it was to Mary, everybody would have looked at it back in this day as whining. Well, yeah, everybody had to do that. We all had to go. If you were from somewhere else, you had to go home. Joseph he had to go home, and it was a long trip. Caesar told you had to go. You didn't have a choice. Verse 7, she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, this is interesting with the inn. This word that is used here is, and I'm thinking back in time when I lived in Florida. Oh, what a happy time that was when I lived in Florida and wasn't in the cold up north here. But we had what was called a mother-in-law's room. We had this little courtyard where my wife had all kinds of beautiful flowers and plants, tropical stuff. But there was a mother-in-law's room across the way from that, and it was a standalone structure. That is what this term inn very frequently would refer to in this time frame. So it wasn't the Super 8 or the Holiday Inn or anything like that that's being talked about. This is the space that people would have for when family came through, when you would invite somebody in who was an acquaintance who was traveling, because there weren't Super 8s and Holiday Inns. You had a guest room, is what we would call it if you live in the South in Florida. It's a mother-in-law's room. Well, by the time, apparently, and we're just purely speculating here, by the time Joseph got there, the mother-in-law's room was already taken. Maybe the mother-in-law had it, and you weren't going to tell her she had to get out. So then it's to where the animals were kept. Okay. Tradition has it, and it's just tradition because it doesn't tell us, that happened to be a cave, which was often, and there are caves there. There's one that they say was it, and it could well be, but we don't need to be hung up on that. You would keep your animals under cover and where they could be protected, and where there were caves, kind of like those open front face caves where there's limestone, you'd keep your animals there. And that is quite likely what this is. So again, the contrast between the power of this man and the relative insignificance of the Christ child, this baby, Jesus, who is born here in these circumstances. Think of who he is, and we'll be looking at some of what the scriptures kind of tell us to put that in perspective. Think of who he is, and that it was under the radar doesn't even do it justice, his birth coming in this way. Completely unknown, except to a bunch of shepherds. And that region was known for shepherds. It was a good place in many times of the year for them to find pasture for their flocks. Now, there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. You notice that they lived out in the fields. These guys were outdoors all the time. And behold, an angel, and behold, when was the last time, just question, it's interesting to think about these things this way. When was the last time you used the word behold, that you, in your day-to-day conversation, speech, engaging with people at work, let's say you're doing a presentation and you put a lot of work into the PowerPoint that you're going to show to the team, and you say, behold, my work of the past 2 weeks. Would you say that? They think, wow, this guy really thinks, or this gal really thinks she's something else. What does the word behold mean? Sometimes it's translated lo. Whoa, this is big. This matters. Pay attention to this. This is a really big deal. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. I will give the spoiler. This is one part in the movie, the Nativity story. I don't think anyone has ever accurately, to my liking, portrayed what it was like when this angel, probably Gabriel, it doesn't name him here. He names himself in other instances within the context of this larger narrative when he appears, but probably Gabriel. I don't know why the Lord would switch it up at this point. What it must have been like when he appeared, because it says the glory of the Lord shone around them. And when we think glory of the Lord, I want you to think of that pillar of cloud that went before the children of Israel during the day, the glory of the Lord that would come and stand over the tent of meeting, and then the Holy of Holies. It was a you can't miss this kind of thing. God flipped on a switch, and these guys had no doubt of who it was who was appearing to them. Also, he was probably floating, but who knows? So that, and why do I say that? Because the Christmas cards show it that way? No, probably because, or at least up on a hill, so that a lot of them could see him. There were a lot of shepherds out there with their flocks, and it was hilly terrain. He had to be up high so that all of them could see him. How do you have everybody be able to see him? He floats. Can angels float? I think that's within their powers and ability. And the glory of the Lord shone around them on the shepherds, and they were greatly afraid. I love the old King James in this, and they were sore afraid. Then the angel said to them, do not be afraid. Something angels say all the time, because when they appear, A, it's out of nowhere. B, they're these mighty beings, and they scare the daylights out of everybody. Do not be afraid, for behold, again, behold, this is a big deal. I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all the people. This coming to these people who were living under the tyranny of this guy. And you can say what you want. We glamorize Rome. It was tyranny. It was tyranny. If you weren't a Roman citizen, and there weren't many of them, Paul happened to be one. The Lord used that in his proclamation of the gospel. But if you weren't a Roman citizen, it was tyranny. You were under this guy's thumb, and it wasn't any fun. So, good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all the people. Let's stop. Let's go. The nations. Let's step into that, right? The nations. The big overarching, one of the big overarching narratives of salvation in the scriptures is the reclamation of the nations. That those nations, that, and this is a pretty good swath of it, of what existed at the time. These nations had, at the Tower of Babel, been put under Deuteronomy 32 here, right? The Lord assigned them to the sons of God. the other spiritual divine entities, B'nai Elohim. They were created, but they were under God, and he told them, take care of all these nations. And they ran amok, and more than these, but they ran amok. They just did what they wanted to do. They got power hungry, and they took it for themselves. And God's plan, using that little nobody guy named Abraham, who had come from up here and come down here at God's direction, he started a new nation through whom salvation was going to come, through whom he would reclaim the nations. He focused in on one, so that he could bring about his plan to bring a Savior who would reclaim the nations. Now, let's go take a look on that note at Isaiah 9. And notice the caption here. I always tell you, I'm hypocritical, I admit. Sometimes when the captions suit my purpose, I'll point them out. Sometimes I say, don't look at those. Don't pay attention to them. They'll confuse you or get in the way. The government of the promised Son. Who's the promised Son? Jesus is the promised Son. We'll jump to verse 2. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Kind of like shepherds out there in the dark, and this great light comes. They aren't the only ones, but that's not coincidental. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. You have multiplied the nation. What's the nation? The nation of Israel, the nation of God's people, the redeemed, and increased its joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of the harvest. What's Pentecost? Pentecost was a harvest festival. Jesus, through the power of the Spirit, sent the disciples out through Pentecost to go to reclaim all the nations. Remember all those names in Acts 2? People from Cappadocia, Pontus, Galatia, all those places. That's where they were to go. According to the joy of the harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Who's really victorious here? Was Rome victorious? No. Were all the other nations and powers and empires that have risen and fallen throughout the 2,000 years since this took place, were they victorious? No. They held sway for a while. They did their master, Satan's bidding, for a while, but off into the dust of history they go. For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. I can't flip back easily to the picture of Caesar Augustus. He's just one. Oppression, tyranny, rule for the sake of the rulers and their well-being, and not that of the people. And it was pictured as a yoke, like you put on oxen and make them pull. Today, we are free-range humans on a free-range tax farm. That's why we exist in the government's mind. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. Question their control, question their right to take from you whatever they wish to take from you, and find out how that works out for you. But all of that is being broken. The rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. What happened at Midian? A few through Gideon defeated the many. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and the garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel for fire. All the tyranny that they have going into the lake of fire in the end. And now another part, you're familiar with Isaiah 9:2. Here's 9:6. For unto us, we're a bunch of nobodies. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. It's a gift. And the government, the true government, the eternal government, all time. We're going to take a look at passages that talk about that very thing, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, David was told, 2 Samuel 7:16, that his kingdom would be forever. And that has nothing to do with the thing that exists over there in this region now that was formed in 1948. It has nothing to do with this. This is a spiritual kingdom. The guy who said, my kingdom is not of this world, isn't all fixated on having a kingdom here in this little spit of land there. It's not the way it works. Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and established it with judgment and justice. How much of that is going on over there right now? From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. Now, let's take a look at some passages that all tie into this, that we could see as jumping from here and through all these different threads in Scripture, that picture of all these different threads finally being woven together into a tapestry that we can understand. We talked about 2 Samuel 7:16, the promise to David. David didn't get to build a house because he was a man of war. Kind of like Caesar Augustus, but a lot nicer. And Solomon would build the house, but David's kingdom would last forever. And who is the ultimate son of David? Psalm 2:6, yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. In opposition to all the nations that rage, the true Messiah is on the eternal Zion. Let's look at Psalm 72. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river, I'll click on it so it's bigger, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Those who dwell in the wilderness will bow before him, and his enemies will lick the dust. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles will bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba will offer gifts. Is this sounding familiar? But the picture being, even though it doesn't look that way now in this thing that we call time here in this world, the spiritual reality is something different altogether. Jeremiah 33. In those days and at that time I will cause to grow up to David a branch of righteousness. He shall execute judgment and justice, judgment and righteousness in the earth. In those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will dwell in safety, and this is the name by which she will be called, the Lord our righteousness. God made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That's not about a geographical location. It is about a spiritual alignment. Daniel 2, that vision of that statue, and part of that statue is Rome. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze, the silver and the gold were crushed together and became like the chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone, because that's what happened, this tiny little stone. You see the picture here. They're in Bethlehem, this tiny little stone, nothing that matters, nothing that seems to really compare in grandeur to the Roman Empire and all the other empires of the world. This tiny little stone, God takes it and chunks it at that statue that represents all their power and might, and boom, they turn to chaff and get blown away in the wind. And again, that's an image they all got. Think of a combine. Those of you who live in places where you can see a combine, we don't have threshing floors. The threshing is done within that big $1 million piece of equipment that takes all the stuff that it cuts out of the field and separates the seed, the wheat or the corn, from all the other stuff. And what happens with all the other stuff? Like Kansas, dust in the wind, away it goes. You see, I use both the geography and the music group. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Baby Jesus, great mountain, fill the whole earth. The eternal reality, the spiritual reality, is different than the temporal and geographical and political reality that we see. Go here to Daniel 7:14. To him, again pointing to Jesus, was given dominion and glory in a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. In Revelation, there are 4 things that are listed off: people, language, nations, and tongues, and different things. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which will not be destroyed. Now, I could keep doing this all day with the different references in the Old Testament that point right to this, but they paint this beautiful picture if we understand the weaving together of these threads properly, this tapestry that lays out for us this profound truth that this little baby who was born where he was because of what this mighty ruler had said, in the end, rules all things. And for us now, Now, we need to understand, and there's this picture when we look at that, all the Christmas cards, the pictures, the decorations, whatever else, this tiny little baby lying in a feed trough with those humble parents there in adoration of him and marveling, and those shepherds coming, the wise men. It's always on the Christmas cards, but they don't come for some time yet. We're not going to get into that. It's its own story. In seeing that, we have this picture, and you can almost see it this way. There's a parallel or contrast. I don't know which it is. In our world today, we got the Jesus thing in there, because let's face it, the thing that makes the Christmas season special, whether people are believers or not, it's about kindness. It's about grace. It's about special things for people who don't necessarily deserve it. That's kind of the Christmas spirit, right? The world tries to have that Christmas spirit without any Jesus. They try to cut him out and leave him out of it, and they end up with this vapid thing of a fat guy in a red suit. And that takes it away. But they still try to maintain the essence of it. We have this beautiful truth that this little child is salvation himself. He is the greatest gift. And we haven't even touched on, and I'm running out of time, we haven't even touched on the fact that the one who was laid there in that manger is both God and man. You want something to celebrate and marvel at Christmas. We can look at the humble circumstances. We can look at all this stuff I'm talking about with Caesar and the power in contrast with the humility of this little baby. God became a man. And he wasn't just kind of a man. He didn't just look like a man. He was a man. He was born right there in that manger. He was born, and he lived, and he grew, and he ate, and he was hungry, and all of the different things that people are, he was, but he was God. It is the greatest miracle ever worked, greater than creation. In comparison, God speaking the world into existence falls, in my mind, about 10 notches down on the scale. God, the eternal, infinite, almighty, omniscient, became a man and lived for 33 years without holding fast to what was his. Try that with Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus grabbed every bit of might, power, and glory that he could find. Jesus hid his. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell. Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us. We got to behold his glory, the glory of the one and only begotten of the Father. That's the miracle of Christmas. That is what makes this all so special. And driven even more by that, he did it because he loved you. You didn't deserve it. We don't deserve it, but he loves us. Just as parents shower their children with gifts and presents. Why? Because they love them. Our Father showered upon us, bestowed upon us the greatest gift imaginable, his Son, whom he was going to crush for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God, so that he could give us his Son's righteousness. That is what this season is all about. I apologize that I did not get all the way through the gospel section here in Luke of chapter 2, 1 through 20. I do encourage you throughout this you could be listening to this at any time. Throughout this Christmas season, read Luke 1, read Luke 2, read Matthew 2, read all of these things and focus on these truths that I have highlighted here, and it gives real meaning, the true meaning, to this very glorious and wonderful thing that is the Christmas season. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.